Everybody, please, can you confirm I'm audible in like the general text space before I proceed? Am I audible? Okay. Good morning to every single person on the call, or good evening time zone. I want to say welcome to Summer Wars Debate Open 2.0. It's an honor having every single person here. We're going to be starting with the briefing, and this is how it's going to be. We're going to start with tab briefing, then we're going to be having equity briefing, then we're going to be having speakers and judges briefing. In case you want the briefings afterwards, this briefing is going to be recorded, so you can still have access to it after the whole briefing has been done. After all the briefing, we're going to be having a master's round, which is compulsory for all judges. So if if a friend is judging and the person is not yet here, please inform them that the master's round is going to be like a judge's test for them, for us to be able to know their judging quality and how to assign them the rooms that they'll be judging in the debate round. So please, let's inform every single person to join in so that they don't miss out on important information that will be passed. With that being said, can we have the tab master come for tab briefing here?
Am I audible? Ife, can you confirm through voice if I'm audible? Ife, can you confirm through voice if I'm audible? Or anyone at all?
Yes, you're audible.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Welcome to Summer Wars Debate Open. The second edition of it. we are going to be kicking off with the tab briefing. Just a quick introduction of Lim Busang on tab as the tab master for you have myself, Olabi Victor Oluwatobi, as the deputy tab master, and also Israel Ajake as the deputy tab master also. So the three of us are going to be tabbing the tournament. So if you have any tab related issues, do well to reach across. So the tab briefing is going to be very, very brief because I assume most of you are used to the way tab is set up and all those important informations. So I'm just going to tell you the special things that might be happening in the tournament. The tournament is a bit big with over 123 teams. So which means things like checking and all those things are expected to be a problem. So please endeavor to check in with your private URLs. At a point in time whereby you have problems checking in with your private URL, we are going to be using manual checking also. So if you can't access your private URL for any reason at all, do reach out to either myself or Ajake to put you on the draw manually. And there are some things that are very, very important also. At a point in time whereby you don't check in with your private URL and you don't also check in, if you message any of the tab masters, we are not going to be adding you to the draw. So we are going to be releasing the draw for speakers first and adjudicators are like later on according to cap discretion. So I think that's very, very important. So let's just move on very quickly. So that's that about check-ins. We are also going to make check-in option to be live. So at any point, you can always go to view the people that have checked in to be sure that your teams are as fully checked in. So it's advisable for every speaker in each team to check in. So at a point in time whereby a certain speaker might have like missed checking for some reasons, their partners can always check in for them. That's just I can see someone writing in the text space that they can't hear. Can I just confirm if everyone can hear me? Or if it's just only that person that is having that issue on WhatsApp? If I once again, can you confirm if I'm audible or anyone at all?
Yes, you're audible.
All right. Have the right to the tab to check in to see your check-in status. So you can always see if you've successfully checked in or if you've not successfully checked in. So that's going to like reduce the number of stories we're going to be hearing after draw is live. So all those things are very, very important. Let's go to the use of the feedback form. I think that's also a very important aspect because a huge percentage or likelihood of you breaking as a judge or not, it depends on this. Note that for this tournament, the feedback form for judges is not over 5, it's over 10. So that means if your judge is a very, very good judge, you are not expected to give your judge 3 or 4. It's supposed to be in the range of 8 to 9. You can always check your speakers and judges manual for that. I think CAP is going to be sending that on the group. So be as judicious as possible with your feedback. Don't be stingy with your feedback marks because just the way you are also competing as speakers, your judges are also competing. So whenever you're on tab, do ensure that you give it according to those ranges. So it's not over 5. For this tournament, it's going to be over 10. And it's very, very important if you don't give feedback on your judges, if you miss 2 feedbacks, you might be ineligible to break, and that's contingent on CAP's discretion. So please ensure that as speakers, you give feedback on your judges, and on as judges too, ensure you give feedback on your fellow judges. For this tournament, we are going to be having panelists to cheer feedback and also cheer to panelist feedback. So everyone is going to be giving written feedback is going to be transparent as possible. So on my side from tab, those are the very, very important things. Do ensure you check in on time and do ensure that you give those feedbacks because those are the building blocks of breaks at the end of the day. So please don't let's like waste time with things like maybe check-ins or with things like ballot submission. So because teams are quite much, so before you give your overall adjudication, ensure you submit your ballot first. So ballot before overall adjudication. So if there is a lot of time wasting, you can always like put those things to a vote, because tab always need those ballot submission to be able to do the draw for the next round. So please don't delay tab, and also don't delay cap. All other issues that are related to that are going to be covered under speaker's briefing and also adjudicator's briefing. So for now, that's going to be that about tab briefing. So I don't know if Ajake has anything to add on tab, and I'm not sure if Basang is also here. But from my end, that's just going to be that. I'm sure everyone is familiar with the tab, and every other thing are just like basic things. So yeah, Ajake, do you have anything to add for a quick?
Thank you, Tab Master, for that fine briefing. We have the officer now. She's trying to connect then speakers and adjudication briefing.
Okay, so hello guys. Can you guys confirm on the text space that you can hear me? I think we're going to be having the adjudicators briefing right now. I think one of the CAP is here to do that. Yeah. So just a moment.
Hi. Let me hope I'm audible. I'm quite in a noisy place, but please text in the chat space if you can hear me and if there is like no background noise from me before I indulge into the briefing details about equity and some of the do's and don'ts.
Yes, that then is audible.
Sure. Well, thank you for all coming and thank you for joining in for the briefing. So, small do's and don'ts from Equity. I'll be the Equity officer together with Alokin Praise Opoloje. So, some of the things you're supposed to respect they include things like heckling. You should not be heckling. That means you shouldn't ask POIs consistently to disorganize speakers. And if you find it like you're going to be a statement is going to be rude to someone in terms of a POI, find a way of rephrasing it and please respect each other in the bedrooms. But also, secondly, you should be able to respect the gender pronouns. If someone referred to be referred to as she or her, please respect that, or they them. Respect that too and be conscious of gender, like gender pronouns and all that. But the third, I'm going to make this briefing a little bit short. The third thing is that you have to respect judges also in terms of whether you want to clash them or something. I'm going to to send in a clash form immediately this briefing is done, and make sure to respect like judges. If you have any clash, it should be through the equity and not necessarily dragging maybe teams or debaters or judges in WhatsApp groups. Try to be ethical as much as possible and try to fill in the clash form that I'm going to send in the chat space later on. So one thing that you're supposed to notice and do not do whenever you doubt someone, refer to them as the first proposition speaker or second proposition. And the third is that you should refer to the panel as a whole. You shouldn't refer to the judges as names or what, refer to them as a panel. And again, this should be done in your rooms to the judges where they should declare what people want to be referred to, because that is like the major thing we have. So, and the last thing I'm going to talk about is that some speakers might have attachment to some motions, or they might not want to engage in some of the motions due to historical precedents or due to what they have faced together with those motions. There is an opt-out policy where you feel you don't want to debate that specific motion. You can opt out and get 0 points, okay? And you just declare yourselves. The other three teams should maybe debate, which I do not expect anyways. But the point here is that there are clutch forms. If you have any problem, any team or any judge, be able to fill out the clutch forms. But secondly, be respectful. These are things that Baraj and Barak in the speeches, at least POI would take a minimum of 15 seconds without heckling. But the fourth thing is that sure you respect each other. If you feel that the statement or the POI you're going to ask is quite going to not make the other feel comfortable, rephrase the way you're going to ask it. So I think that's it from the equity. It's all about respect and being ethical. I'm going to send in the clash form and also the document, the equity briefing document in the text space. Thank you.
Okay, yeah. So for equity, we're done with equity. Now we're going to be having the adjudicator and speakers briefing. So yeah, that's all we're having now.
Okay, just to confirm if anyone can hear me, you can put in the chat if you can.
Yeah.
You can hear, yes or no? Yes. Okay, great. Amazing. So I won't really spend much time. I'm not doing training. I'm doing briefing. So if you were expecting training, I'm really sorry. I'll just like run through speakers briefing, what we expect from speakers, and like obviously things that may be beneficial as you proceed with the tournament. So that the very basic part, really, is just like the introduction to BP debating, because I was told that there were novices in the tournament, people that are new into BP debating. So yeah, just like the basic introduction to BP debating, the roles of BP debating in general. So that's the first part when it comes to a briefing. Okay, so on the roles of speakers in BP debating, so I won't be like really going into depth here. I'll just like touch base on the basics. Opening government. Opening government, your obligation is to set up the debate, and like obviously define the debate in a fair way. Opening opposition is just like either challenge the definition from opening government, or you stick to the definition and then you provide a substantive. Speakers in the opening half then. PM generally is just like dividing the debate, setting up like the limits of the debate where the debate is happening and where the debate is not happening, and providing like one or two substantive. DPM is just like probably your main role is rebuttal and rebuilding. And obviously, if you have enough time, then you can add one or two substantive from what your member your PM had said. This is similar to opening opposition. That the leader role pretty much firstly is to either you accept or deny the definition from opening government, provide substantive, and obviously rebuttal. DLO, your main role is rebuttal and rebuilding, and obviously you can provide one or two substantive. Please note, I'll be very clear here. There's always a trend in BP debating where deputy leader of opposition oftentimes does like what we call like backloading. Oftentimes, like depending on who your judge is, but obviously if you meet good judges, backloading is not allowed in BP debating because you're being unfair to opening government because all your material is now coming from the DLO at that point. So it's not strategic to apply backloading, especially if you meet good judges, because like they know what the rule says, particularly if like they're reading like the manual of WDC. So please make sure you are not at any point doing any backloading. All important substantive should come from the first speech, from the leader of opposition. Obviously, you are still allowed to provide like new material. This is like where you are different, like where the deputy speeches are different from the whip speeches, because in the deputy speech you can still provide like new material, but like there is an amount of material that you can provide in deputy speech that we can consider as fair for everyone in the round. So please be very careful if you're a deputy speaker. Going to closing half then. Closing half, your role is very simple, pretty much providing an extension from what the opening half had said, and like direct engagement or like the diagonal engagement as well. The difference between everyone else with the whip species is that like the whip speech in most instances is not really providing like new material. But we need to be very clear on what new material is, because in most instances there is like that kind of misunderstanding of what exactly defines new material. So by saying new material from whip speeches, we are simply saying like a new argument altogether. So new whip speeches can still provide things like new rebuttal. They can provide like new examples and like new nuanced analysis on like the existing argument altogether. So if like you already built an argument, you can still provide like new examples in your whip speech. That's still okay, and you can still provide like new mechanisms as well, or like new impact, as long as they're impacting the already existing argument at that point. So like that's really pretty much really on whip speeches. Whip speeches as well, like the other thing I would just like emphasize is like you need to be very engaging towards all the teams. It's unstrategic, just like engage one team and leave the other. Obviously, there are some rooms where there's one team that is clearly losing the debate, and you may assume they are losing and you don't engage them. That's unstrategic because you really don't know what's on the mind of adjudicators in most instances. Probably maybe between that team and you, there's like really that kind of a close call on like who wins the debate. If you don't really engage them at that point, then it means you lose out at that point. So for you to work best on your strategic plan, make sure you're engaging all the teams as well. I won't really say much more detail because obviously if I now say more, that's like training. Yeah, but I'll be open for questions. The second thing I want to talk about is POIs. POIs are very important in debating in general, and obviously there are rules that apply when it comes to POIs. The new rule, according to the World University Standard, is that like across teams, you should accept 3 POIs. So, for example, if you're an opening government, you have an allowance of accepting a minimum of 3 POIs. How you distribute that is between the speakers. So please make sure, to some degree, like do follow that. I know it's not always like practicable that you do accept 3 POIs, and in some instances, you only just want to accept 1 POI or 2 POIs. That's still fine, but please, just to be on the safe side, do accept POIs and do ask POIs for engagement purposes. You may ask, why POI is very important? Mostly POI are important when it comes like to close decisions where judges can like then flip calls using POIs. For example, if like, there's a close decision between opening opposition and closing government at that point, we look at things like, okay, on the engagement level, like how did both teams then perform? This is where sometimes judges then tend to look at POIs to say, okay, what were the POIs that were asked by opening opposition to closing government, and what were the responses at that point? So those things are very, very important. If opening opposition asks POIs and closing government doesn't accept any of the POIs in a close decision between the two teams to a point that like judges can flip the call to anyone, in most instances, the call goes to opening opposition because judges then assume that a strong POI from opening opposition could have been asked to closing government, and closing government could have failed to respond to that POI. So to be on the safe side, always make sure you do accept 1 or 2 POIs in your speech and 3 POIs across the team, the whole team as a whole. That will really work best towards you. That's it on POIs. The third thing I'm going to talk about is definitions. And this is very important as well when it comes to set up and having like a fair debate. Definitions. Opening government, as I said before, you have an obligation to provide like a fair and accurate debate. Please don't squirrel the motion and don't define the motion in an unfair way or in an unreasonable way at that point. So if opening government obviously defines the motion in an unreasonable way, opening opposition from leader of opposition, they have a mandate or they have a duty to then challenge that definition. You may ask, okay, what do you mean by unreasonable definitions? Unreasonable definitions in most instances can apply to anything that we can see to be unfair in a debate. Assume the motion that says this house would allow humans to donate organs, for example, those kind of motions. And then opening government defines the motion and say, if the first part, which is like the soft line, unreasonable definition, which is say, or the only thing we are going to allow to donate is like, for example, blood. At that point, that definition is already unfair because like, yeah, you can tell, just like they say they want to donate blood, or they may go to the extreme and say, oh, we are going to allow the donation to only happen when these people are dead, and like only family members will then have the kind of the capacity to donate like those kind of things. For example, if you die, they can donate your heart and so forth. Again, that's unreasonable. So opposition like has a mandate to challenge that definition altogether. Who challenges definitions? Only the leader of opposition has a mandate to challenge the definition. If the leader of opposition accepts the definition of prime minister as true, then it means the whole debate he has to follow on that definition. Obviously, you from closing, for example, there are two things that you can argue. The first thing that you can do is provide like a form of clarity of what the debate was supposed to be about. What you're doing here is you are not challenging the definition, you are providing the clarity of what opening half debate teams missed. But you are not debating only your clarity. What you're doing is you want to debate based on what opening half said by using an even if analysis, at the same time providing like detailed material on what the debate ought to be about at that point, which opening teams had missed. So, for example, if opening government had defined that motion and say, oh, can only allow this when people are dead, for example, and then family members are the ones that are going to then provide the kind of the kind of donations, blah 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 blah. If you're in closing government, you don't have to rebut your opening, or you don't have to like accept the actual definition. What you can do is just like provide that kind of clarity to say this is the debate in opening half. So both teams engage the debate on the spectrum. From closing government, we don't think this debate is about this for these reasons. And please note, it's very important that when you are not challenging, but when you are explaining what the debate ought to be about at that point, you give reasons. It's not enough for you to just like say, this debate is not about this, and then you stop there. Give reasons why the debate is not about what opening half it said in that call. But secondly, what you want to do is you want to provide an even if analysis and say, even if the debate was about what opening half said, why do you still win? Because for you to win the debate is you need to be engaging with all teams into reframe or may likely take a fourth or a third at that point. So you want to be on the safe side to say this is the clarification, but even if you don't buy this clarification, engaging the debate from what opening half it said, we still win on the spectrum. So that's very, very important as well. So yeah, I think that's the other thing on definitions. Some definitions as well, for example, if like they require like place limit or time limit and so forth, please be mindful if you're in opening government that you are not limiting the debate in an unfair way or in an unfair premise. For example, there are some debates that will require you, for example, to have like a limit on like where the debate is happening. Like, for example, if like the motion says this house believes that feminist movement ought to use like, let's say, religious rhetoric in their campaign or in their campaigning platform, for example. Obviously, this debate may happen more in Western liberals than it is happening mostly in developing states at that point. So when you're limiting your debate at that point, you need to be very careful on how the debate is being limited. Like some people call it parameters, on like where the debate is being limited at that point. So the strategic view then, like you limit the debate in a way that it may be fair and accurate. So it's very easy to say, if I'm limiting this debate into Western liberals and where they're using like rhetoric, like let's say religious rhetoric in their campaign movements, I'm just like looking at the nature of the feminist movement in those regions and how they look like and why this debate then ought to happen there, as opposed like to this debate happening in Uganda or happening in Rwanda at that point. That's very important. Please don't limit the debate like on a time spectrum, like in an unfair way. Obviously, there's some debates that would require you to limit them in a like using the time spectrum. For example, saying like, oh yeah, this debate is like happening in the 21st century, and those kind of things. That's fine. What's not okay is like saying, oh, we think this debate is happening like in 2019, like or 2017 or something like that at this time. The same thing when it comes to like place setting. You can't really say this debate is only happening in England, for example. Even if it's happening only in England, you need to look at the nature of the motion. For example, if the motion says this house would abolish the British monarchy, at that point, then yeah, sure, the debate is happening in England because the motion is really, really specific to one particular group. But if the motion says this house opposes the monarchy, really, you can't really claim that this debate only happens in Britain, given like that we have like the Sweden also has a monarchy, also have like Swaziland, they also have like a monarchy at that point. So when you're limiting the debate, you need to be very, very careful on like whether or not it is very motion specific that this debate is happening at that point. If it's so broad and then you decide to limit it to England, for example, you need to be very clear and be specific why the debate is limited to that particular country. What's the actual harm that only exists in that region that is not in existent in other regions? So, for example, if you say this debate is limited to Western liberals, for example, it will be very clear why Western liberals oftentimes face like so much consequential harm as opposed to other regions as a whole. So that's it on definitions and motion limits. How then do we argue ideas? Teams, I'm not so sure if judges are on the call here, but if they are, if judges are on the call, on this call, I'm not really sure if they are, but this is a speaker's briefing anyways, but I'll just like try to be comparative in both judges and speakers. In most instances, there is this huge tension between principled ideas and practical arguments. Please note, both principles and practicals in debating weigh the same, so teams need to make sure they engage on both spectrums. So there is usually like some speakers usually struggle on how to respond to principles. So I'm going to give you a tip here. You take it or you don't, that's up to you. So responding to principles should be basic. You don't have to struggle when you're responding to a principle. So there are 4 ways how you can respond to a principle. Which are the 4 ways? The first part is a direct rebuttal to the principle. So this is just like saying, yeah, we don't really think their principle is meaningful on this spectrum, blah, blah, blah. That's the first part, really. Like, this is what most people usually do, like the direct rebuttal of a principle. The second way of doing a rebuttal to a principle is providing a contesting principle. So how does this look like? The first thing is like, you need to consider what the outcome of the principle that the other team is portraying, and then you provide the counter prop of that principle, something like or like along those lines. So what you have to do, for example, is like, let's say if proposition says there's a obligation as a principle that we need to act in this kind of way, you can also co-opt and say, look, we do agree that there's an obligation to act, but who better meets that kind of an obligation? Oftentimes, this happens in motions about like the role of the government or the role of social rights movements, where Prop argues a principle of like why the state has a duty to act in that way. You don't have to argue against that duty or that obligation. You can just like argue about like why you better meet that obligation on your side of the house. For example, if the motion says this house supports like the quota system for women in politics or in leadership positions or something like that, proposition then says women oftentimes like face like they face struggles when it comes like to climbing the political spheres, and therefore when you apply these quota systems, it means you're meeting that kind of obligation to break things like inequality and so forth and so forth. You can argue and say, yeah, sure, we think that there's an obligation that exists, that we need to break inequalities and those kind of structures, blah, 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 but we don't think you better break those kind of structures by providing quota systems. And then you can, at that point, you then explain why quota systems are harmful and why, if they're harmful, they then harm that kind of obligation that you have on the side of the house, and then do a comparative analysis on why, when you don't provide like those kind of like quota systems, oftentimes there are mechanisms that then allow these individuals to better able to climb that ladder and therefore fulfilling the obligation that you have at that point. The third thing that you want to do is the third thing that you want to do here is like probably question like the thought experiment that the other team is trying to push. For example, oftentimes when teams argue principles, they use like things like intuition pumps and those kind of things. So what you want to do in your rebuttal of that principle, you just like need to make sure you're questioning like the intuition pump and trying to just like show why that principle may not apply the same way in which the other team is portrayed. There's so many kind of example that I can use, but since it's not a training session, I won't really have enough time to like explain like how you can apply thought experiment. The only one I'm going to use, for example, which you guys can then try and use to derive other thought experiments in debating, it's up to you. The thought experiment that I normally use, I'll give you guys 2 thought experiments. The first one is on promises, and this oftentimes apply in certain motions about like, let's say, the role of the government, parent-to-child relationship. So if the motion says this house as a parent will do X, or this house as a government has to do something, so it's always boiled down to like the promises that parents have, or like what the promise that the government has towards individuals through things like the social contract and so forth. So what is the thought experiment when it comes to promises? For example, the thought experiment says, if you promise someone anything, you owe them that. So, for example, so by making someone a promise, you are setting expectations that will inform how they will act in future in order to maximize their preferences. For example, if you promise someone a partnership in a debate tournament and you don't show up, they might have prepared very hard for the tournament in order to have a fulfilling partnership with you. It means they either have to opt out of the tournament altogether, or they have to become an iron person speech. So what you're doing then, if you don't show up, is we are doing a harm by limiting their ability to fulfill their own preferences at that point. So the promise asserts an obligation on you to fulfill it, to avoid doing those harms to other people. That's a thought experiment. So in debates then, if argues about like, okay, this is the role that the government has, to say the government has this kind of an obligation towards its individuals, you can question that thought experiment and say, okay, if the government has this kind of a promise and that they don't fulfill that promise, what's the actual harm? For example, the government has an obligation to protect you. They didn't write that in writing that they are promising you that. But the promise from the state is, because you guys pay taxes, you guys obey the law, you guys do a lot of things, the government then promised and say, if you do all these things, we protect you. So this means in times of crisis, like let's say if there's COVID-19, the government has an obligation then to provide things like resources that ought to benefit like you as an individual, because that is a promise that they gave it to you. If they don't fulfill that promise, then it means they are harming you in certain aspects. That's another way on how you can respond to a thought experiment, or to not a thought, but to a principle as a whole, and say, okay, this is where the principle applies, or this is how we fulfill the principle better at that point. And please note, principled ideas and practicals oftentimes may have similar responses, but most people fear principles. That's why it's very, very difficult for them to respond towards to the principles. Secondly, I want to be very clear as well, because I already told you that principles and practicals oftentimes will have similar responses, or will have like similar weight in debating. So I will also want you guys to be able then to make sure that your principle, the similar way you engage your principle can be a similar way you engage your practical ideas, because judges are going to weigh those like in a similar aspect. So I would really, really recommend that you do engage both in a marginal way. You can also engage the principle using a practical idea and show why that principle can't be a standalone principle and is contingent to the practical outcomes. This oftentimes apply in principles such as responsibility, reparations, and so forth. For example, Prop may argue about why there's a principal obligation that, let's say, our government is to provide certain things, blah, 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 blah. But their principal obligation may be contingent on practical outcomes, and say, look, they managed to run this principle, but we're still unsure though on why that principle is a standalone, because the principle itself, even if there is a duty for people to act, if it doesn't really contribute to practical outcomes, the likelihood is it can't be beneficial. An example is on reparations. So if the motion says these are supposed let's say paying back reparations to African states, blah 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 blah, those kind of motions about white people paying reparations to African states and so forth, Prop may argue about like why there's a reparatory duty due to like the former injustices, and like that those former injustices then require the like people to return back what they stole from Africa and so forth. That is a principle that Prop may run. In opposition, what you want to do is you don't want to deny that there's a principle that ought to be done to say people have to repay back like those reparations. What you want to do is you want to prove that that principle is not a standalone. You want to prove that the principle is contingent on practical outcomes. That is to say, if you pay reparations, and what is the actual benefit? Because oftentimes people want to argue and say when you pay reparations, then you emancipate these kind of individuals. Then they have to prove that the likelihood of that happening is likely going to happen or is true. So from opposition, you can argue and say, we think the money that could have been used, the money that could have been used to pay reparations could have been channeled in other meaningful aspects. For example, saving like world hunger, being donated to charities, and like solving like the issues of like homelessness, even if it's in Africa, for example. Note that is not paying reparations. This is coming like as a form of like humanitarian aid to this kind of states. This is different from what Prop is saying, because if Prop says reparations exist and they don't prove the mechanisms that these reparations are going to benefit the people on the ground, for example, people in home, in orphanages, or in children's home, or like aged care homes and so forth, then the likelihood is like their principle is not as marginal or as meaningful as they had claimed at that point. That is your engagement in that principle, and they're using a practical idea. So what you're doing here is like you're saying this: they run a principle, but the principle that they need to prove is like that is going to materialize in the practical outcomes that this principle is contingent on. It's not always the case that the principle is standalone, because what we mean by principle is it's a moral value or a moral stance that to say this thing is a right thing to do regardless of the outcomes. But in most instances, really, a principle should have an outcome. Not should, but in most instances, principles have outcomes to say if we act in this kind of way, this is the actual outcome. The same thing like we do in our daily lives as well. I won't say much about this because I think that's really like too much. So that's pretty much it really on debating and the speaker roles and the definitions. I don't think there's anything else. Everything else comes from equity briefing about like how the procedures of debating and the rules and so forth. I'll take questions if there are any. Other than that, I think I'm really good. Perfect. Oh, types of motions. Oh yeah, the last part is types of motions. So in this tournament, you're going to experience different types of motions. So we have like the motion that says this house regrades. That's the first part. So these house regrades are retrospective motions. Proposition teams defend the world without the existence of what is being recreated, and they provide a counterfactual. This is the only time proposition teams provide a counterfactual, because in most instances, opposition teams are providing a counterfactual. Proposition teams provide a counterfactual in regrades motion. So for example, if the motion says this house regrades the teenage stream, so what you want to do from proposition is you want to prove why the teenage stream is harmful, and you want to defend the world to say if there was no glorification of the teenage stream, we would have glorified things like A, B, C, and D, and we think these things are much more marginal and they are beneficial as opposed to the teenage stream for these reasons. That's the first thing. Opposition teams in regress motion, you are defending the status quo, you want to prove why the status quo is marginal, but also you can challenge firstly the likelihood of the counterfactual of team proposition. So you can say, for example, team proposition claims that if there was no like a glorification of the teenage dream, we would have glorified like let's say this kind of aspect. There are no mechanisms to prove that is true for these reasons, and you don't think that was going to be likely, was not going to happen that way for these reasons, and then you list your reasons. So this is like the first type of motion, which is like the regret motion. The second type of motion is opposes. Opposes similarly, it's the same way, it's similar to the regrets. The only difference is in opposes, you don't provide a counterfactual from proposition. So for example, the motion can say this house opposes the teenage dream. So you're just like list, it's like more of like the harms benefit motion really, as opposed to it being a retrospect from like with if we compare it with like the regress motion. So that's how they differ. Everything else is similar. The third motion is a support motion. And I'll be very clear here, and I think this is very important for people to note. Support motion oftentimes happen the similar way with the policy motions, this household. The difference between the two motions, this house support and this household, is that this household requires a detailed model, while this house support only requires a surface level model. You may ask, why do I need a model in support motion? The reason why you need a model in support motion is because support motion oftentimes require a change, but it's mostly something that is likely going to be introduced, something that is new, that is not really functional. For example, you can have a motion that says this house supports let's say the creation of a global carbon market, for example. Sure, you can argue about the benefits of having a global carbon market, but in most instances, opposition may argue on basic level surface things like, okay, sure, even if you support the creation of a global carbon market, why is China going to be incentivized into buying that kind of a global carbon market? What are the actual benefits really that you think they're going to exist? Why would countries really oftentimes comply with that kind of a global carbon market? So all those kind of things then need to be answered by your model, because in your model then you can just set up okay, this is how this market is going to look like. This is how countries are going to bring if there's a division of the market of the what do you call it, the tokens, those kind of things that you give in the market and so forth, who is going to be regulating the market and those kind of things that can be answered in your model. But it's a brief model, obviously, because it's a support motion as opposed to it being a policy motion. So this is where it's very important that in support motion you also need a brief mechanism of how whatever you're supporting is going to look like at that point. The fourth type of motion is the policy motion, this household. This household motion oftentimes require you to answer 5 questions and 3 phrases. The first question is what is the problem and what is your solution? How are you going to solve the problem? When are you going to solve the problem? And how are you going to solve it? When I say when are you going to solve the problem, we are not asking about the date to say, oh, we want to solve this problem by 2023, for example. That is not what the debate is asking. The debate is asking about the urgency of the problem. Is it an urgent a problem that requires urgent solution? Are we at a tipping point? For example, emotion about climate change in most instances. Are we at a tipping point? Those kind of things. So that's what we mean by saying, when do you solve the problem? Is there some forms of agency that requires the policy to happen now? Yeah. And the 3 phrases that need to be answered in your model are the first part. The first one is the efficacy of your model. Yeah. Oftentimes, because people assume that we don't assume, but we give some fiat and say, in debating, we have enough money to do everything that we want to do, but we don't give you enough fear to assume that whatever you want to do with that money is going to be successful at that point. So what you want to do is in your first part of model, you need to prove the efficacy of your model by showing us that this is actually going to work and is practical. The second thing you want to do here is want to prove this justifiability of your model. So how justifiable is your model? And the last part is on legitimacy, whether or not your model is legitimate and you're giving reasons. And oftentimes when I do coaching, I just say the legitimate thing become then the first principle that you're going to use in your arguments, because you're just linking everything that you have said and then saying, okay, we think this is legitimate for these reasons, and then providing that kind of a principle as well. From then we move to the beliefs motion. So beliefs motion are divided into 2. So we have this house believes that X should do whatever. So these motions oftentimes are value judgment debates. They ask you to debate based on the neutral observer and so forth. And also these motions as well, some of them, if there's a should in there, they require some form of a model as well. Not a huge model that is similar to this household, but it's a simple model really on how that is going to look like. For example, if the motion says this house believes that the West should align with the East, for example. I think like there should be like a clear mechanism of like how that alignment is going to look like. Is it like more of an economic alignment? Is it like a political alignment? Those kind of things. It's very, very important. Similarly, if the motion says this house believes that the Horn of Africa should trade with the East, those kind of things. So we just like have to have a clear understanding of like how the trade within the East is going to look like when the Horn and the East are going to be trading together, those kind of things. So it's very important that in beliefs motion as well, we have like mechanisms of how things ought to look like. Oftentimes teams try to be smart and they start blaming judges and say, oh no, but I don't have a duty to give mechanism the fact that it's going to work. In every motion, you don't have fear to assume that things are going to work. You need to prove that things are going to work the same way you have claimed. So you don't have enough power, just like say this trade is going to work and it's going to be beneficial. There are mechanisms that you need to follow and prove that if they do it this way, the likelihood is like they're going to be beneficial in this kind of spectrum. For example, there are different ways in which countries may trade. It can be foreign direct investment. For example, it can be like basic exchange of goods and services, those kind of things. So really, in your mechanisms, you need to be very clear on like what exactly you're trying to defend at that point. The second type of motion that exists in this house believes is this house believes that is an actor in the beliefs motion. For example, if the motion says this house believes that Joe Biden should push for the nuclear war deal with Iran, this motion, even though it's judged on a value judgment and say it's based on what the neutral observer thinks, but the neutral observer is not just using their own thoughts, they're using their thoughts based on Joe Biden's ideologies and what Joe Biden cares more about at that point. So it's not enough just like say, oh, this is not an actor motion, not about Joe Biden. Even if it's not an actor motion, not about Joe Biden, but at least though, what does Joe Biden's interest really represent at that point? Obviously, if like he is Democrats, he's one of Democrats, what do Democrats really care more about? Those kind of things. Yeah, obviously, you don't confuse this with an actor motion. This is not an actor motion, so it's not always that you run about the incentives of Joe Biden, but also is what I'm saying is like when you're just value judging, obviously you would look at like whether or not Trump would have done this or Joe Biden would have done this, because like these two individuals like they're quite different. So like your value judgment should be based on what the interest of that actor would look like. This then leads me to the next type of emotion, which are actor motions. Actor motions are debated based on what the incentive of the actor are, regardless of whether or not there's a consequential harm to the other party. If that doesn't really affect the actor, or if the actor doesn't really care more about those kind of things, then really, the debate doesn't really care about those kind of things. For example, if the motion says this house as a parent would do X, for example, so this motion really is based on what the parents' incentives are towards their children. So it is less about children, but more about parents and what parents' incentives are. Obviously, though, like some of the arguments will be like contingent on each other, because you are proving that parents should do this for their children. So you are proving that like parents should care for their children, and then you are giving reasons. But oftentimes, like when you are providing reasons why parents should care, you are also like providing like the benefits to the child, to the kids, and so forth and so forth. But please don't confuse this and like spend more time talking about children themselves without really talking about parents. This applies in a lot of motions as well. You can have a motion that says this house is China will do this, this house is NATO will do this house is X will do this, those kind of things. So oftentimes just know that this debate is just based on what the actors' incentives are and like what they care more about. The tip here is, if you get such a motion, for example, that is an actor motion, you'd firstly need to identify who your actor is. Sometimes you may have like motions that have like an actor that is like, let's say, a regional body or an entity. For example, this house is African Union, who have a single currency. For example, that can be a motion. The first thing that you want to do is you don't want to argue about the benefits and the harms of having a single currency. What you want to do is you want to understand who African Union is, what they care about, what are their goals, and so forth. And then you're looking at their goals, and then look if those goals do align with what the motion says. If African Union's goals, for example, is to maximize things like trade and those kind of things, and then you look at, okay, so if their goal is to maximize trade, does having a single currency increase that kind of ability to maximize your trade? If your answer is yes, then you use that as an argument and say, sure, the first reason why we think African Union will care about this is because, one, their primary goal is maximization of trade. We think having a single currency then fulfills that primary goal that they do have, and then you give reasons why that will fulfill that. Yeah, that's the first thing. What you do not do is just having a debate that will then argue and then starting to use examples about the Eurozone. Oh yeah, the euro is failing and therefore it will fail in Africa. Yeah, sure, you may use that, but where's the link? What's important is the link, because those are two different regional bodies with two different goals. So you still need to provide mechanisms. I'm not really saying you can't provide that. You can. What's important then is once you do, just provide some forms of mechanisms as well. In your providing mechanisms as well, in your analysis. The third thing is sometimes your actor. Sometimes your actor may be harming the wider society with their actions. So sometimes it's very important as well to look at what the actual harm and whether or not your actor should care about that actual harm that is probably harmful to the vast majority of individuals. Oftentimes debaters will just from opposition will come and argue and say, oh, even if there's a harm to 100,000 of individuals, we don't think this actor should care about these kind of things. What you need to understand here is who is your actor? The first thing I ask myself, who is your actor? If your actor is let's say the leader of a country, oftentimes the leader of the country should care about their own people. So if their policies affect thousands of people and people die from those kind of policies, then it means that they should care about that, because their primary incentive, the reason why they are in that position is because their primary incentive is their own individuals. So it's not enough just say they shouldn't care about people when that is their primary obligation as well. So it's just very important that in actor debates, you don't always just run away and say, we think the obligation of the actor is A, B, C, and D, and therefore everyone else who is harmed by their actions or by the action of that actor become less important. You need to prove why they are less important if their primary obligation provides that. I think this is similar, just say, for example, if you are a pilot, and it's now obviously let's say you're having, it's about to have the plane crash. Let's say on a practical basis, this can happen. I don't know if it can, but let's say it can happen. To say it's almost let's say the crash, the air crash, they were those kind of, when your plane is about to have the plane crash, yeah, and then the pilot then uses a parachute, and then they just drop off and everyone else dies. Obviously, someone will say, oh yeah, obviously they should care more about themselves and so forth. But even if that is true, that they should care more about themselves, they also have that a duty towards the people that they're carrying, because obviously the same thing applies to bus drivers. They can't just run off the bus and let everyone scroll down and die. So it's very, very important that you look at your actor first, and then once you have looked at your actor, you look at what kind of obligation do they have to these individuals that are extremely affected or that are most vulnerable in that instance. So this is actor motions. Look at the intent of the actor, but let's look at who they are and what kind of contribution do they have. This also may apply in motions about let's say if you can have a motion that says this house as the Kardashians will do this kind of things. Oftentimes people oh yeah, the Kardashians don't really have a duty to certain individuals, but they do have a duty to other people, really. I can say black women. That's my thought. But yeah, it's really this kind of thing. So when it comes to actor motions, really people should be really, really careful. The last type of emotion, which is, it never used to be common, but it's now getting common, is an actor motion with a policy. So the motion would be this house as X would do Y. So what you want to do in those kind of motions is you are not only like debating as what are the incentives of the actor, but also debating like the mechanisms of like how your actor is going to implement a certain policy at that point. Similar motions to this is like, let's say this house as the UN would implement like, let's say, fairness doctrines. So a fairness doctrine pretty much is like a law or legislation that allows all broadcasting media sites to broadcast fair views. So for example, if like you let's say for example CNN is broadcasting like views about like that is like extremely liberal, the law then forces them to not only provide liberal views, they provide both sides of the house. So if you provide a liberal view, you need to have like, let's say, a view from the conservatives as well. If someone comes and says, like someone who is pro-abortion and come and say, okay, we think people should have abortion rights and do this, they should also invite someone who's anti-abortion and provide like their own views. That is like a fairness doctrine in summary, to say they should provide like fair rules. So the motion can come and say this house as the UN would implement the fairness doctrines. Yeah. So what you want to do is, the first part is like, you can explain who the UN is and what they care about at that point. And second part is you need to explain how they are going to implement that fairness doctrine. Because it's not enough for you to just like say, oh yeah, they should implement it, and then start arguing about like the harms and benefits of fairness doctrine. Again, the debates are not always about harms and benefits. Sometimes debate about like the mechanisms of whether or not this is going to work. Is it effective? Is it legitimate? Those kind of things. So really, 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 we need to be very careful. I'm really sorry for taking hours and hours of speaking. But yeah, this is just a summary of what I was trying to give to you guys. It's like so much complex. It's a lot. But it's briefing anyways. If you have questions, you can ask. Yeah, if you have questions, because I'll end up speaking till tomorrow. But if you have questions, you can ask now. Okay, no questions. I think we are good. I'm not so sure what's next. I think it's master's round, but I don't know.
.45 GMT plus 1. Then it starts by 1 p.m. GMT plus 1.
What's the time now?
12:32 p.m. GMT plus 1.
Okay, so about 30 minutes. Okay, let me know when it's time, really.
Okay, then.
Yeah.
So, everyone, thank you all for making time and being available for the briefing. The master's round is important for all judges. So if you're a judge and you're a speaker, because they've done the briefing, you definitely need to listen to other speakers, other pro speakers speak, so that you can also be able to practicalize it during your speaking. So master's round is going to be starting by 1 p.m. GMT. Then after that, we're going to release draws for round 1 so that you can prep. Then judges allocation definitely come out after. So yes, till then.